Continuing debate, the honourable member for Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it is good to be able to enter into debate and what is an important subject. And let me make a couple of quick observations here before I get into the substance of this debate. I find it very, very concerning, Mr. Speaker, that whether it be through the parliamentary secretary from Winnipeg to the House Leader, I believe, or the parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Health, there seems to be a great disregard in the government's attitude towards the democratic will represented by parliamentary committees and ultimately the Canadians that those committee members represent. You know, Mr. Speaker, that is very, very concerning. The fact that the parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Health refused to commit or acknowledge that this RFP, should this be passed by this House, should be stopped. They have time and time again used clever wordsmithing to simply delay the current RFP that's being discussed here for purposes that are related to either competition or various other things. But, Mr. Speaker, they seem to be going out of their way to suggest that the democratic will of, in this case, a parliamentary committee made up of members of Parliament that have been tasked to do important work. The Ethics Committee does important work. And it seems that this government is obsessed with avoiding that accountability. And, Mr. Speaker, that digs at the very, very heart of why, certainly I hear on a daily basis, and I would be shocked that if members in the Liberal governing party, if they didn't hear on a daily basis the concerns that Canadians have about the erosion of trust. Now, they'll stand up and say everything's great, sunny ways, and that sort of rhetoric that we've heard often from that Prime Minister across the way. But, Mr. Speaker, incredibly concerning. Now, Mr. Speaker, if you would indulge me just for a quick moment, I do want to share something that happened back in my constituency, a little bit unrelated to the subject at hand. Mr. Speaker, what we do in this place is incredibly important. And I had the opportunity to judge 4-H public speaking this past weekend, Mr. Speaker. Now, generally, an MP probably shouldn't enter into a judging position because ultimately you have to pick winners and losers. But, Mr. Speaker, let me simply say this. It was incredible to see, and as a former 4-H'er myself, 4-H woodworking from when I was a kid, and who participated in public speaking with what at the time was a pretty serious stammer. Mr. Speaker, it was an absolute honor to be able to share with, to hear from, and to see these young men and women from the Camrose Beef 4-H Club, to hear about how their speech is a wide variety of subjects. And, Mr. Speaker, what I suspect, and then I'll get back to the substance of the debate here, but what I suspect is that in the coming years, it wouldn't surprise me one bit that if one of those who participated in the event the other day will one day be running for office themselves, because the exceptional work that 4-H does generally in preparing the leaders of tomorrow, but also the folks involved in the 4-H public speaking that I had the honor of attending and judging here this past week. So a great round of applause to all of those individuals. Well done. Now, Mr. Speaker, it has been, and I know it was highlighted by the chair of the committee, the member from Calgary Rocky Ridge, about how there has been a concerning, what I would suggest is a disparity. Last week, the committee heard some testimony from the Minister of Health on the subject that we're discussing. And this morning, we heard testimony from the Privacy Commissioner. And I would like to highlight a few of those differences, a couple of those differences. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Health, who was not actually the Minister of Health at the time when some of these decisions were made, but the Minister of Health talked about how, and certainly made it sound like, his department had been thoroughly engaged with the Privacy Commissioner over the course of the pandemic, and specifically related to this. Yet, Mr. Speaker, we learned that that simply was not the case from the testimony we heard from the Privacy Commissioner this morning. Mr. Speaker, it's things like that that call into question, serious question, the credibility and the trust that certainly this place needs to be able to have in the ministers of the Crown. And I would suggest, Mr. Speaker, that that erosion of trust is a big part of the reason why this related specifically to the motion at hand, where we're going to press pause on this RFP to make sure that Canadians can in fact trust that their government is, in this case, protecting the privacy rights of Canadians. The fact that there are some pretty serious differences, Mr. Speaker, is incredibly significant and cannot be understated. You know, this motion, it seems to have been overcomplicated by Liberal members who have entered into debate, which, Mr. Speaker, I would note, has not included Liberal members of the committee who actually voted for this motion. So, Mr. Speaker, it's very, very simple. It says we should simply press pause so that Canadians can trust their government. And I would note that one of the significant reasons for that certainly as I asked the Minister of Health and have brought up as the discussions related to the topic at hand, Mr. Speaker, is that there is it's unclear, Mr. Speaker, exactly what the information that was provided to the Public Health Agency of Canada was. The Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Health, in quite an ironic twist, sent a letter to the Ethics Committee that outlined why it was important, why it wasn't a big deal and shouldn't be cause for concern. Yet, Mr. Speaker, I would note that the company Blue Dot, of which a sample was provided along with the letter from the Parliamentary Secretary, that called into question whether or not, A, the Parliamentary Secretary had even read the documentation that he had provided, and further, whether or not it was the extent of the information that was being provided. You see, the minister talked about anonymized, de-identified, and segregated data. Mr. Speaker, that's fair. And there's been reference to, cell phone use and mobility providers and all of the other aspects of what the reality of living in the information age is. Specifically, the Privacy Commissioner did note today, in addition to the specifics of this, that much of our privacy legislation is 40 years old and is way out of date. And I know other members of the committee have also noted this from different parties. But, Mr. Speaker, what does that data look like? What information was provided to the government? When given the information, the sample report from Blue Dot, there were striking inconsistencies. The information largely was incredibly general. Quite frankly, information that I wouldn't have a problem with. But, Mr. Speaker, that information had to come from somewhere. And it is unclear exactly what further was provided. To simplify it specifically, Mr. Speaker, does de-identified and anonymized mean that names and phone numbers and addresses were removed, but maybe everything else was provided? The very evidence suggests that they tracked the specifics about whether or not somebody crossed a border, that they talked about they would group together in one metric, but they wouldn't be grouping together cell phones in another metric. In fact, Mr. Speaker, if you can believe this, the members of the committee couldn't even verify the numbers of devices that were used in some of these questions. So, Mr. Speaker, as I come to the end of my speech, I would simply suggest this. Canada's a democracy, and a democracy can only function if its citizens trust the institutions in terms of Parliament and their government, of which in our parliamentary democracy, Parliament gives authority to. This is a prudent and important step to ensure that we can help rebuild some of the trust that has been eroded, and is incredibly important that this not only pass, but that Canadians' privacy is respected. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question et commentaire, questions and comments. The honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I asked a very quick question of the chair of the committee, and I'm going to pose the same question. I asked in regards to what can we expect if it goes to committee in terms of the amount of time it would take in order to pass so that an RFP can be issued, and the chair implied that it could be quite a while. If you read what he said, it could be quite a while. We all know that standing committees can actually do things virtually in 2-3 days, very substantive things. Why would we not want to give some sort of a tangible indication? Is it a week? Is it a month? Is it 6 months? What is it?
The honourable member for Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I think that question emphasizes the fundamental misunderstanding of what's being debated here. Mr. Speaker, this is and it's not a prop because it's the actual motion that is being debated. It was one of two motions that the committee dealt with at an emergency meeting that took place just prior to Parliament being brought back. The first is the study that is ongoing, which the member from Winnipeg North seemed to insinuate when he asked the member from Calgary Rocky Ridge the question earlier. Now he's actually referring to the concurrence debate that's taking place now, which is incredibly simple, one sentence, which says just this: we need to press pause until Parliament can affirm that the privacy of Canadians can be respected. Two fundamental differences, speaks to the great misunderstanding, I think, that comes from the members opposite, or they're intentionally playing politics once again on issues that are hurting Canadians' trust in Parliament and the government.
Commentaire, questions and comments. The honourable member for Prince George, Peace River, Northern Rockies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just thank our opposition members that are very concerned about privacy. As again a former member of that committee, and we did a lot of work from around the world. And somebody mentioned Shoshana Zuboff and many of our other colleagues that are literally globally that care about this issue. But this simple, sort of nonchalant issue that this government has with people's privacy and data. And it's illustrated in the decisions they're making or not making. We talk about Huawei. We're calling over here to have a pause on Huawei in Canada, and these guys are just, don't worry about it, guys, it's okay. And it's a big deal for us. Anyway, I'd just like to ask the member, are you confident that this government takes Canadians' privacy seriously?
The honourable member for Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and the simple answer to that is no. And I think we have seen that on display here by how flippantly the Liberals are taking what is a very, very serious issue. We see it also with how they've dealt with the Huawei situation, and time again, not only do they not take the privacy of Canadians seriously, but it seems that these Liberals don't take democracy in Canada seriously, Mr. Speaker. And that is an utter shame, that we have seen an erosion of trust within our institutions that is hurting the ability for Canadians to be able to trust what goes on in this place and the institutions of what makes Canada an amazing country. So, Mr. Speaker, we need to start rebuilding that trust, and this motion is one simple path forward to say, look, democracy matters. We're going to press pause until Canadians can trust exactly what their government is doing.
Question et comment.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Trois-Rivières. Mr. Speaker, when we talk about ethics, fundamentally we have one tool that allows us to work, and that tool is called dialogue. And dialogue, what's that? Well, it's more than just one party discussing internally to find the way forward. Unfortunately, what I've heard today from across the way is a monologue. A monologue that was an answer to an extended hand from us, from members of the committee. And what did we get from them? Nothing. So I would like to ask my colleague if he is confident that our colleagues from across the way will vote with us for this motion.
Battle River Crowfoot in 30 seconds or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And from listening to the speeches, I'm not confident And I find it tragic because when in the context of committee, this motion was passed unanimously, as was the motion to study the larger issue of the use of mobility data related to the pandemic. Yet we see what appears to be a huge disconnect between the actions of that committee work and the attitude of the government across the way. And Mr. Speaker, I would simply note, none of the Liberal members that were a part of that committee participated in this debate. And it's unfortunate because they seem to be willing to collaborate when it was in the committee context, but then when it comes here, when it doesn't fit their political interests, they seem to slam the door on discourse and dialogue and debate and what ultimately leads to good government. And I want to thank the member for the reference to discourse, because that's exactly why this place exists. Every square inch of this amazing country is represented here. We can have debates in this place, and that fundamentally is what the House of Commons, the House of the People, is meant to be. And I'm glad that we have been able to demonstrate some of that through this discussion here today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Okay.
Resume.